right, as we continue our series regarding the book of Job, we at last come to this second to last chapter regarding Leviathan. And we discussed last week how there's a clear difference between the behemoth and Leviathan. And I pray that in the time we have, we will certainly at least see that. However, given the time that we have, there's much to speak of Leviathan. And so we're basically this is going to be an abbreviated consideration of this portion. And by God's grace, we can at least press home some of the most pertinent details and most pertinent information. Now, as I've mentioned in the past, some people see the Leviathan as a crocodile. Some people see it as a whale. Now, this kind of started right around the Renaissance, where people were wanting to attribute a real animal to the behemoth and to the Leviathan. I think this is a worthy endeavor. You know, for the longest period of time, these were somewhat mystical or mythological creatures, and the Leviathan truly is. He's a sea creature, and we'll get into that here in a minute. But as we mentioned last week, you know, the behemoth was, I think, really showing the goodness of God, really making this massive creature who is absolutely safe. We were going to see this sea serpent, this sea beast, this sea monster is of a different persuasion. He actually delights in the sorrows of men. And so we will get to that in time. So again, though, they're trying to figure out who this Leviathan is, what this Leviathan is, you know. So some people saw the behemoth and Leviathan as dinosaurs, but others wanted to attribute, again, an animal that Job knows of. Again, it wouldn't make any sense for God to be bringing up any beast or any sea creature of whom Job is absolutely unfamiliar. Now, I must admit, I'm not dogmatic about any of the positions. I would probably lean closer to the whale, but as you read this, I mean, a whale doesn't have scales, but it could be indicating the strength of the skin of the whale. So I do see it closer to that. And I wanted to mention in Genesis 1, chapter 21, this is when God created the fish and the birds. So it says, so God created great sea creatures and every living thing that moves, with which the water abounded, according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. Now, in the King James Version, it actually says God created great whales. Now, the Hebrew of this is tanin, and that really has to do with a dragon or a sea monster. Now, in my opinion, we'll consider the other areas where the Leviathan is mentioned in the Bible, but this very well could be pointing to, there's a dragon mentioned in the book of Revelation in chapter 12 who chases the woman and her child, and there's much to that, and we're not going to get into that. And then the following chapter, in chapter 13, John depicts a creature, a great beast coming out of the sea with 7 heads and 10 crowns. And that is very similar to Daniel's prophecy in chapter 7, still in chapter 7, before he goes into the Ancient of Days and then to the Son of Man. So as you read this, because it would be a vain hope to try to get through this whole chapter today, that's just not going to happen. Okay, so as you read through this, see where this is fulfilled in even some of the prophecies, specifically Isaiah, which we will consider, but see where God's really seems to be indicating or equating somewhat this Leviathan as a mass of chaos. Now, in creation, I didn't want, but in pagan lands, especially back in that day, ultimately they taught that there's kind of they had a dualistic theology where in the beginning was utter chaos, and ultimately the light and the darkness are at an eternal struggle and so forth. But essentially the evil sea monster was conquered, and the good took over, more or less anyway. Where in creation, in the Bible, we actually do originally have chaos. You know, God created the heavens and the earth and everything in the beginning. God created the heavens and the earth. However, the earth was void and full of darkness. The darkness was upon the face of the deep and so on. And then God spoke order, okay? But it wasn't a struggle. See, this is the difference, clear difference between the pagans and the Christian worldview and so on, where God is a master over all, okay? So as intimidating as this creature is, and is truly how he would delight to see our suffering and so forth, God controls this beast, and he controls all these beasts. So, without further ado, let me go into Job in chapter 7 and verse 12 also had asked, am I a sea or a sea serpent that you set a guard over me? He also said, and this is one of the first, well, it is the first time Leviathan is mentioned in our chronological order of our books in the Bible. Okay, so in chapter 3 and verse 8, he says, may those curse it who curse the day, those who are ready to arouse Leviathan. This is when he's cursing his birth. I don't know if you remember that. I know that was a few weeks ago or weeks back now, but he was cursing the day of his birth. And then he's cursing really he began with the day of his, his being made, and then really the day of his birth. But he's saying, may those who curse it, who curse the day, those who are ready to arouse Leviathan. Now there are people, and we will see this through the testimony of the Bible regarding this Leviathan, that there are people who are seeking to arouse the Leviathan. And let me just say at the outset, there are people all around us who surround us who want to arouse evil. Just may evil rise. They suppress and they despise the light of God. Okay, and we will get into that in our subsequent message regarding the demons and so forth. By God's grace, I think these interlope fairly well. Okay. In addition to this, in Psalm 74, verse 14, he says, you broke the heads of Leviathan in pieces and gave him his food to the people inhabiting the wilderness. Now, this has to do with the deliverance, with the exodus out of Egypt, okay? And ultimately, he's saying you broke the heads of Leviathan, the great sea monster. Again, this is a picture of absolute evil, from whence we are being delivered, from whence the Hebrews were delivered. In Psalm 104, verse 26, it says, there the ships sail about the great wide sea. There is that Leviathan which you have made to play there. So, this is part of God's creation. He had made this creature. Now, this goes into the fall of Satan as well. Now, we've mentioned that in theology, we say that a third of the angels fell. Well, where that comes from is in that 12th chapter of Revelation, where the dragon flings a third of the stars to the earth. Okay, so it might be a little bit reading into it somewhat, but there's definitely a faction of the angels who fell along with Satan. And again, we will consider that in more detail in our subsequent message today. But this is what he's talking about. There, the ships sail about. There's that Leviathan which you made to play there. You have made him, and he is playing there right around the ships, right around where people are in danger, but they don't know it because they can't see this creature and so on. But there, this sea monster, this beast, is ready to attack at any given time. He's ready to suppress the people. He wants to destroy the people. The sorrows of the people bring him great delight. And finally, in Isaiah 27, verse 1, it says, in that day, the Lord with his severe sword, great and strong, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, that twisted serpent, and he will slay the reptile that is in the sea. Part of the definition of the Leviathan is a wreathed, twisted serpent. So, this is kind of a sea serpent. Obviously, at least to me, illustrating the serpent in the fall. Let us remember that Satan fell long before we did, and how he enticed our first parents to sin. Let us remember, and always remember, that he has a limited amount of control. We are not his puppets. We are not God's puppets. He doesn't force us to do either wickedness or goodness, but he will put things before us. He will put his word before us. He will feed us with himself and so on, so that we might walk the straight and narrow path. But Satan does the same thing. remember, in the garden, he asked Eve, hath God said? This is the continual temptation. This is how Satan tricks us. He lies to us. And this is, so Satan, before we get into him next week, he ultimately has two weapons against the Christians, against men and women in general. He's one, the tempter. That one's easy enough. But again, he doesn't tempt us internally. We are tempted internally. He can tempt us with something that we want to engage in. Many people see Satan as this goated figure with a trident and so forth. That is a nonsensical picture that the medieval church really made to assuage the devil. They thought his point of vulnerability was his pride. So they thought if they made fun of him, then, that would cause him to flee and so forth. And unfortunately, this has come down to our age. And now we just find the idea of Satan or even evil spirits ridiculous. And we'll get into that again, more detail in our subsequent message. I'm sorry, but we have much to cover. So again, this is the sea serpent, okay? Now, part of the etymological derivation of the Leviathan goes into lava. Now, this means to be joined. So when he talks about, because we're not going to be able to get there, he talks about the scales being so closely joined together. In other words, this is giving him utter protection. Nothing can really kill this beast except for God. So this beast cannot be tamed, he cannot be hunted, he cannot be sold, which we will get to, God willing anyway. He can't be bargained with, you can't make a pact or a covenant with him, nothing of the sort, okay? But ultimately, God is the one who will bring this creature down, just like Isaiah was saying, and just as the book of Revelation had said. Now, let us go ahead and get into this passage. It begins, chapter 41, verse 1 begins, can you draw out Leviathan with a hook, or snare his tongue with a line which you lower? Can you put a reed through his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Now, can you draw out Leviathan with a hook or snare? Now, this is really a fishing. I mean, that one's pretty easy, but the second hook is really one of those harpoons. So it's one of those javelins, so to speak, which have an arrow with a line attached to it that you would throw, and that would pierce the fish or the great sea creature, and so to speak, and then you would reel it in. But again, this one's absolutely protected. You are not going to get through his scales or through his skin and so on. However, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention here, this hook, I just wonder, because remember Jonah was in the belly of the whale, or of the sea creature, for 3 days and 3 nights. And Jesus says, just as Jonah, so the Son of Man will be in the belly of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. I think Jesus is the thorn to this Leviathan. I think because this second hook is ultimately a thorn. Again, it's this harpoon. So God is asking Job, and he's asking all of us, can you draw out Leviathan with a hook, or snare his tongue with a line which you lower? Can you put a reed through his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? No. Mankind has no power over this animal, even if we wanted to. Even if we were to hunt him down and try, we would not be able. So, but I also think there's some symbolism here where Jesus Christ, likening himself to Jonah, is the one who hooks this Leviathan, this sea serpent, ultimately into the abyss. Verse 3. Now these we are going to spend most of the time on. Will he make many supplications to you? This is essentially praying. Will he pray to you? Will he seek your favor? Is this great beast, is the devil himself trying to seek your favor? No, if anything, we seek his favor. He draws us into him. It's not like he prays to us and so forth. So now these questions, the will he and so forth, so verses 3 through 6, I think can be applied to Leviathan or the devil himself or to God. Will he make many supplications to you? Either the devil neither prays to us, nor does God pray to us. We pray to God. Okay? Secondly, will he speak softly to you? The devil will never speak softly. He will in temptation. alluring you with beauty. See, again, we see the devil as this horned goat and so forth, a foolish thing. The devil is actually the angel of light. He's a beautiful angel. He comes in beauty to allure you to himself. So, but he will not speak softly to you, and he will not speak softly about you. Again, he is the accuser, and this whole thing began with Satan's accusation about Job. And so I think this is a fitting conclusion for God to be giving this to Job. He's not outright saying, hey, this whole thing started because of that evil Satan, because remember, God did give him permission. But ultimately, he's just illustrating this great power of suffering that you have been enduring. I have control over this great. So the Leviathan of evil is also the Leviathan of suffering. All evil, all suffering, all maladies, all illness, all darkness stems from sin, from Satan and sin. He is the father of lies, but he will not speak softly to you. God, through the incarnation of his Son, speaks softly and gently to us. He convicts us. He convicts us, but then deals gently with his children, far different than the oppressor of the brethren. Verse 4, will he make a covenant with you? Will he make a contract with you? If he does, it's to your destruction. If you make a compact, if you make a covenant with the devil himself, you are trading your soul to be given to him for his own pleasure, to see you, for you to join him in hell. Will he make a covenant with you? If he makes a covenant with you, he will not keep it. He is the father of lies. He will not make a covenant with you, and if he made a covenant with you, do not trust it. God has made many covenants with his people, and he remains faithful. He remains true. So can the devil make a covenant with you? Even if he tried to, avoid him. But God makes a constant and faithful covenant with his people, where you take him as a servant forever. This is incredible. Again, let's remember that this is specifically referring to a sea creature. So are you going to make him a slave? But ultimately, remember, we are all slaves. We are all ultimately slaves. We are either the slave of sin and the devil, or we are slaves of righteousness and of our Savior, of our King of Kings and our Lord of Lords. Liberated. We are thus liberated slaves under his tutelage and under his service in this world and in this time until the time to come. Until the time to come. But right now, we are always slaves. The devil is a slave of no one. He submits. He must submit to the Almighty. He has no power. He has no authority outside of that which God permits him. He allows him. So he's not omniscient. He is not omnipotent. However, he is far more powerful and far more knowing than any of us. So he is a fierce lion, prowling around, seeking whom he may devour. And we must be careful against his attacks and so forth. Always being aware, always keeping watch and so forth. But let us always remember that we serve a faithful God who will never leave us, who will never forsake you. But he sent his Son into the wilderness to be tested. He will send us all in the wilderness to be tested. However, when he makes a covenant with his people, he keeps his covenant with his people. Will you play with him? Will you play with him as a bird? Can you play with the devil? Can you play with God as you would a bird or a slight little pet, like the smallest of all the pets? Can you do this? We have no power. He might play with us like a bird, and God will not. God will tend to us as a bird. He will feed us as his sheep and so forth. He will love us this way. The devil will parade us around as fools and blind. Okay? But we cannot play with him as a bird. We cannot play with God as we would a bird. Or will you leash him for your maidens? So will you lock him? Again, will you enslave him, essentially? But will you draw a line and keep him within your grasp to parade him in front of your maidens and so forth? No, we cannot. We do not have the power to do this, but this is what the devil wants to do. The devil wants to keep a leash on you to parade before all of his minions and all of his demons, and also to accuse you before God. This is what he takes great delight in. Remember the beginning of this book where he's just proud, going to and fro upon the earth, ultimately seeking whom he may devour. And then God says, okay, that's great. Ultimately, Satan's saying, I have this whole world in the palm of my hand. I control everybody. They are all submitted to me. They're all my slaves. And then God says, have you considered my servant Job? What about Job, Satan? And then Satan thinks, well, yeah, does Job serve you for naught? Does Job serve you for nothing? We serve God because of who he is, not because of what he's given to us. Yes, we are only able to serve him and to worship him in spirit and in truth because of what he's done, because of what Christ has done. But ultimately, this is the accuser of the brethren, fierce and strong and so forth, but submits to God and to his Son. Or will your companions make a banquet of him? Will they apportion him among the merchants? So this really has to do with once you hunt down the devil, or once you hunt down God, are you going to make a buffet? Are you going to make this huge feast? You can't hunt him down. You can't kill him. So you can't make this banquet. And then he goes on to say, will they apportion him among the merchants? So ultimately, sell him in the marketplace. Trade him. We cannot do this. We do not have the power. But again, this is what the devil loves to do. This is what the devil loves to do. Tear us apart. Tear us apart and feed us to all of his demons and so forth. And also, to trade us. We're just puppets to him. We're just meager nothings. He just wants us to join him in hell. He knows where he's going, and he wants to take as many with him as he can, as he possibly can. And the only way he is actually able to do this is because God has permitted him to do this. Why does he not just send him into hell now? That remains a mystery. I have conjectures and so forth, but that is to be left a mystery this side of the Jordan. However, those are all of the Will's questions. Again, if you were to read this, consider what he's saying about this sea serpent, and then consider what he might be saying about the devil, and then consider what he might be saying about himself, and certainly how that relates to us. We're ultimately powerless in this paradigm, okay? We are to wrestle against the world, the flesh, and the devil. Okay, so the world brings upon many allurements that we're already tempted to engage in. Okay, and then we have our own eternal struggles. This is the flesh wanting these things, but the devils, the demons, the spirit of this age also comes to allure you with these things of which you are already tempted. You already want them. And so they bring them before you as much as they can. And by this, you are being tested. So remember, when God sent Jesus into the wilderness, that was to test him. However, that testing was through the temptation of Satan. Remember, God tempts no one, but he tests all his sons and daughters. He was testing Job here. He was tested through this whole time. And then God comes out of the whirlwind. Remember, we mentioned the creation of chaos. And now he's talking about this beast that likely in the Near East, where Job is from, would be the one who was defeated ultimately, the one who had to be cast down for a time anyway. And so he comes out of this whirlwind and tells him to consider all of the heavens, the earth, then the beasts of the field, the beasts of the air, and then this curious and mysterious large beast who eats grass like an ox and so forth. This one's absolutely safe. Then he goes in to the sea monster, of which they already had great fear. This was kind of the source of evil. When they would make these maritime trips and so forth, whenever they encountered great storms, or if they were broken and many people were lost, that was attributed to these sea monsters. Greek mythology had these, Roman mythology had these. Most, if not all, of the mythologies have something akin to this Leviathan. But in the Judeo-Christian worldview, in the Judeo-Christian paradigm, under Yahweh, Yahweh is supreme. Yahweh reigns supreme. It is not an eternal struggle between good and evil. It's an eternal goodness that is working out his goodness even through evil for a time. Now, I find it very gracious of God to conclude it this way. I'm sorry we didn't get through much, but I hope in your own study you can maybe expand upon this on your own. But at the very conclusion, verse 34, it says, "He beholds every high thing. He is the king over all the children of pride." God talks about this sea serpent as the most proud of all the beasts because, again, he's untouchable. Nothing can harm him. No creature in the sea, no creature on the land, no bird, no man can harm him. He's the greatest of all the beasts, so to speak. So he is the king over all the children of pride. And ironically, so this is a king. This is a king. And his subjects are all the children of pride, who he would kill in a second and delights in destroying. He delights in the sorrows of men. You will see that in your own reading of this. He delights in the sorrow of men. This is a tyrannical, despotic king. Again, our king is a servant king. Christ is the king over all the children of humility, all the children of grace, his grace. So he concludes, the last thing God has to say is this beast who he is going to destroy is the king over all the children of pride, wherein we serve a king over all the children of grace who has been covenanted into the covenants of God, into the community of God. So I think this is a gracious, gracious conclusion. And let us also recognize here, all of what God had said to Job, every single thing, except for that short time period, which again goes into this. We'll get into that here in a second. But everything else he said was by way of illustration. Who else is that like? Just like his son. Just like his son. Son and the Father are one. And so I hope in this closing salvo, at least before we consider the final chapter of Job's restoration, and again, what James has to say about Job, I hope you see that the nature of God is the same nature of his Son. The nature of God the Father, how he comes to his servants and so forth, his Son comes likewise. They are one. He is merciful, and that's what he's doing here. He pierces his heart with this last thing. Job is already fearing and trembling, and God knows that, and so he comforts him at first. Tells him about the behemoth. And then, for one last stroke of sanctification, he goes into this Leviathan. And ultimately, though, just as he had said, he is the ultimate judge of all the earth. Remember, in the beginning of the previous chapter, of chapter 40, he goes into, would you indeed annul my judgment? Would you condemn me that you may be justified? So again, that goes into the justice, and then it goes into the strength, and then it goes into the beauty of God, and then ultimately his absolute dominion over all the pride and wickedness that resides anywhere. On the earth, out of the earth, in the earth, and so forth. In the seas, and so on. He destroys, he puts down the proud and the wicked by a simple gaze. And again, I hope we can see the point, just as he is doing here with Job, that he is lifting him with a simple gaze. In fact, one of the things Job says, I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. First I knew you by your testimony. First I heard about you. Now I truly know you. I have seen you. You've lifted me. You've saved me by your gaze. Again, that same gaze is going to condemn all the pride and wickedness of man and all the pride and wickedness of the spirit of this age and all of his minions. So now that we are finally going to go into this final chapter, of course, I've absolutely ask that you read this last chapter, read what James has to say about Job before we get to it next week, because it'll be a much lighter message, God willing anyway. Through all of this, God is not only proven still faithful, but he is glorified, and his servant is sanctified, and his friends are saved. Out of all of this chaos, out of all of this suffering, out of all of this turmoil, out of all of these questions, out of all this dark counsel, still radiates the great refulgence of God, which he shines forth for all of his sons and daughters, just as he did with his servant Job, just as he does with all of his sons and daughters. We will see. Let me just give you a little glance so that when you read this, he restores Job with twice the amount Job had initially. Just so you know, in the Levitical law, this was required if you stole something, if you took something unjustly. And we will have something to say about that. God did not take it unjustly. It was taken unjustly, though. And by God's providence, by God's wonderful grace and mercy, he provides Job with what he deserves, what he has earned through all of this. God willing, we will consider that next time. All right, praise God.